Hi there, Randi here, and welcome to another one of my podcasts where I share insights and experiences that I have derived from my own memories in this life and other lives and lives beyond this solar system. What I want to share today is a kind of a story, and it goes into my Buddhist life. And sorry about this huffing and puffing and coughing. As you always know, when I begin going up in energy, I need to clear out all of the distortion energies that have gathered there, which are unfortunately a side effect of, let us put it this way, in many ways utilizing energies within inside this physical form that is to a large degree unnatural for our true composition and what we are as advanced civilizations within this and other realms. So, where do I want to go with this story? I have shared some of the end of that life that if I died, or the version of me died in 1959 as a Tibetan monk under the horrendous torturous hands of a Chinese soldier, due to, I think it must be the Lhasa uprising. I'm not sure, but there was an uprising at the time. I can't say it's that, but it is significant that it is the year 1959. And Tibet had definitely issues with China at the time. You can look that up on the internet. But that's not where I want to go, because one thing that we could say, the first thing, at least that's how it is in my experience and when I am dealing with past lives, is that the first thing I remember is my death. So that's kind of the access point. And you can ask, how do you recall a death? And it's actually my body that releases different types of biopatterns. We have talked a lot about the emotional patterns in the transition sciences. But when we talk about the biofield, that's where we have got the patterns of past lives stored as a biological imprint, because that's part of the biofield. And that's tied to our human DNA. So that's a cellular type of memory that goes way beyond. And the way that arises is, of course, through the clearing work that I have explained in the whole transition sciences courses 1 to 7, as well as the advanced clearing work course 1 to 4. So that goes into these deeper understandings of how to work with the different fields. And the first one that we begin with is, of course, the heart field, so we can vibrate energy and learn to vibrate energy up so it can activate and clear and transform and transmute and lead us to the insights that are necessary to have to begin to clear out both the mental field but also the biofield. But that's not where I want to go. This is just the concepts that are needed there. And for further investigation, I can only refer to my classes, as well as quite a lot of the information I am giving on my other channel, The Future Humanities by Randi, where I put in some strategies and processes for the progression work, as well explaining some of the newer concepts that we are to get acquainted with. Because what's the goal of my classes and what I've made as part of the whole academy? It's not about teaching or creating a new teaching system. It's about learning how to master energy by going into the meta perspective and understand the dynamics and the mechanics of energy and the reality field we're part of. So that's the first and most important understanding. And when we talk about some of the Buddhist concepts, and I'm not going to go into more than what I already have done in my take on Buddhism that are working with what is known out there and what most people talk about, there are other approaches to this. And this is where my memories come in. I came to, people today would probably call it a monastery, but it wasn't. It was, it's placed in Tibet. I can see the Himalayas, or at least a group of mountains. I assume it's the Himalayas. As I've said, other places, it's impossible for me to go in and say which city it is or where it is, because first and foremost, I know it's in Tibet, but at that time, I'm talking a different language, which I haven't learned in this life. So even though I know the name of the city, which I know in my mind, my brain has no tool to translate it. I have no concepts or ideas of how to pronounce it. And my brain can't process that level of information. So what I can process and what my brain can process is the memories and the experiences. Because as I have trained with my many encounters with different extraterrestrials, as well as inner terrestrials, as well as meta-terrestrials and systemic and solar and stellar and what have you, from the different reality fields. And I'm just putting it in there because these are also using a different terminology, which is not similar to our words. So there, the translation of concepts and ideas and imagery is something that my brain has learned or been forced to learn over the many, many years I've practiced doing the inner work and the expansion field, and the ability to perceive in other realities that are not the same as remote viewing, not at all. It's the ability to process complex information systems that are part of whatever reality field we are existing within. And these are the concepts of learning to work with energy. Energy is and are, because it's energy can both be single but also a plural is that it has multiple layers, and these are complex information systems that are imbued with code systems that can be read via the radiation field that aligns with these different code systems and merge with it and interpret it, and by that create what we could say unfoldings of content that our perception field via the vibrational energies are able to interpret and translate into whatever language that we currently are utilizing. But that takes time to be able to translate this, and that's part of the brain that needs to learn this. And this is part of, again, I am born in Denmark. My native language is Danish, but I've learned English and I learned German, forgot that again. I have learned Hebrew, forgot that again. I learned Greek, forgot that again, and Latin, forgot that again. So I've trained my brain in processing different languages and understand contextual information systems that are also what we call constructs of mind, that are expressed through language, that are expressed through different concepts and ideas of what we want to express via these sequences of sound that technically are code systems, because they are tied to thought forms, they are tied to emotions, they are tied to visions, they are tied to different forms of visual content that the brain produces. So in that manner that we don't really need the language, we can go and interpret things as visual content for those of us who have the ability to see things visually. I've always been very visual, but I trained my visual cortex to connect further with my eyes and with the higher levels of my brain and the different types of information I got from these different layers. As in, I saw something, didn't know what it was, investigated it further, began to put words to it, and kept putting words to it until I found the words that rung true, that were in alignment with the codes and the information I got. That training I got from being a psychotherapist, where talking with clients as well as during my schooling as a professional psychotherapist, I had to learn to translate the emotions that the client was talking about. Sometimes clients have not got the words for the emotions. They only have their experiences, and they're struggling to find the right word. And as a therapist, you learn to understand what is that energy, what is that type of experience that is expressed there, and what is the most appropriate type of terminology to mirror back to the client, as well as expresses it in a different way so the client gets an understanding of what's going on and what these experiences are. So that's also a way to translate an experience into concepts and words and constructs of mind. So with that background, you here have the understand that when we do work with past lives, it is not about, oh yes, I was born in that city in that year. If it's within the same language, for instance, I have memories of past lives in England. Well, there it's pretty simple for me to say that's that year. And I could even, if I look further, I could scout for street signs if it's in a newer time. But out there in the mountains, there were no street signs. This was a little rural village. We were this little, I would not like to call it a monastery because it wasn't a monastery as we knew of them. There were 4 houses that were gathered together in that little section where we lived within a little stone enclosure. The little 1 meter tall fence built by stones around it. It had an open, a point where you could go in and out. So it was not isolated. It was possible for the ones that were living there to go to the little village that was down the hill. And some of the ones, those who had chosen to live there, some of them were able or chose to actually teach the children in the city or in the village. Some of them were also participating in pottery and in farming and other things or everyday life circumstances that were important to keep the village functional. At the same time, what was it that we were doing up there in these houses, those of us who chose to go there? Well, first and foremost, the concept and the understanding is that this village were strong believers in reincarnation. And they were also due to these elders that were gathered together up in these 4 houses. Each and one lived in their own house as part of a little group of other elders, let's call them that instead of monks, that had chosen to study some very ancient texts that were significant for that village. It had been handed over through many generations, and why that village had that type of text is unknown to me. I came there, or I was selected from the village. Actually, I think I came from another adjacent village because these elders, they were also traveling the other villages to find the children that had the inbuilt memory of studies already done in past lives. So that means that those of us who had already studied the contemplation practices, I'm picking my words very carefully here because I don't want to fall into the thought forms of specific words and ideas that are within the Buddhist teachings, because the purpose of this one is actually to give a different account so we get it out of the concepts of the Buddhist teaching systems or the ideas that are now the prevailing both within the Theravada expression of it, as well as the later editions that have come, whatever versions they are, the renewal of it from Sri Lanka and other places where it was dug back up and recreated, which is not what I kind of learned where I was living in that elder community. So this group was focused around the understanding. First and foremost, the ones that were picked there were the ones that already had kind of achieved what we would call the Bodhisattva level. That meant already were practicing without any effort and without any focus on it, what we understand as kindness, had already connected the heart and the mind, where the chitta, as expressed in what we could call a higher type of compassion, were expressed naturally as part of our human demeanor or our personality matrix. It was something we already had without. It was a kindness that we were born with, an understanding and an empathy that expressed itself into natural understandings of do's and don'ts. These children did not have to get much teachings. I have seen other examples of this. They kind of observe and learn by observance, and they are not learning, they are remembering what they already know. And it's not that these children remember, oh, I was this or that or whatever in a previous lifetime, because that's not always accessible, all depending on what kind of the Bodhisattva path that we had chosen. Some chooses to, in the moment of death, to erase that as well, so that we can begin anew and do it all over again. And in these processes, transform more of the distortion planes so that more can prosper by our redoing and undoing and becoming again from scratch in each lifetime. That is also one of the more tougher versions of the Bodhisattva path, where you literally are born as a blank slate. You do not have your memories of a past life. You just have the sensitivity for doing it all again. It is, of course, part of your DNA and is part of your biofield, but your emotional field will be more aligned with that of your parents than that of who and what you were in a past life. So that's a different way to go in and take on what we could call community service for the world as it is, because that was what we were working with in that community where I was selected for. We worked with the reality field energies. We worked with the world energies. It was not as much a practice of enlightenment or a practice of Buddhahood. It was a practice of how to transform energies within the cosmic realms of existence for all of the different creatures that were there. And now I say creatures, which means they were kind of created, but in a way, we are all a creation of the cycles we have been part of. We are a creation of our choices and our actions and what we have, how we have expressed our energies as part of this reality field, how we have taken our individual section of the reality field, formed a vessel, formed different forms of fields that are called the scanders, from where we have conceptualized the sense of self and the sense of existence within these different fields, from where we then again focus our attention on how to transform energy and create as little distortion as possible, so that the birth of the others that will come after will have the opportunity as part of the collective field to choose a different types of existence than the one that has been presented to us from the earlier times of this age. As you recall from some of the Hindu teachings, there are different kalpas that have different aspects that must be played out. And this is one of the more heavy ones. And it was already that back then in the 1950s and in the early years where I was selected for that community. I came there when I was around 10. So if my best guess is that when I died as a Buddhist monk, I was around 35. So that's kind of where we could say, well, if that happened in 1959, I'm not going to go into do a lot of calculation here, and then we kind of we go back some 30 years. Well, that would be 1929, and then extract 5 years from that. So that would be 1924 or something where I was born. So that's the early stages of the 19th or the 20th century or the 1900. So with that understanding, it's also a completely different society, and it was rural and it was primitive, and it was, as we see, many of the communities that are still living the old ways in Tibet as it is seen today. Okay, so where I want to go with this, aside from all of the other little pieces of information here, is the practice of mindfulness. And that's the fancy word we have invented. Because what is mindfulness? And there's a lot of good teaching systems out there that try to explain it. And I will just say it as I remember it and I was taught it. We were not taught the word mindfulness. So what did the teacher, the one that were overseeing me or assisting me in my practice of remembering and my practice of coming back in alignment with my pre-existing knowledge so I could continue the path I had chosen to express my life force and my consciousness potentials and my transformative processes within, because it is clear, and it was clear in the ideas that we worked within, that each and one of us choose a specific path from where we achieve the highest potentials of what we are and what we can become. And in that, we need to transform energy. And these are, as I call them, or it's been given to me from some of the inner teachers that have chosen to stay behind. It's called the exemptions, the 4 exemptions, which later on, my best guess is similar to what is called the 4 jhanas. But the way I work with the 4 exemptions are different. And I'd like to explain that later on in another podcast. So the practice of mindfulness is for me the practice of observance of energy and how we utilize energy in our thoughts and our emotions and our actions and our everyday practice of living. Because once we go in and begin to live in a way of where we are observant of the energy that we're utilizing either for good or for ill, and the goal is to become harmless, which means that we create as little distortion as possible, because it is a foundational understanding that first and foremost, distortion of energy is harmful to the reality field itself. It's like pollution. There is a reason why our world is so polluted, because we are using the resources of our planet in wrongful ways, and that leads to regression and pollution and illness and disease. So we understand that the way to work with energy should not be for selfish purposes to uphold our own fields, but should be in service of the reality field we are part of. And we exist and coexist with the reality field to transform that reality field. We coexist with that reality field to transform what the world is, including ourselves, but not through ideologies or political standpoints or written down narratives, but through who and what we are. And this is where, as my teacher used to tell me, which I also will call him my dear friend, told me that a feather can weigh a ton, all depending on the way that it floats in the wind, so to speak, a little bit. It's not correctly translated, but the most important thing is the understanding and the meditation upon how can a feather weigh a ton. And that goes in a little bit with a practice or a little exercise I rediscovered today. I will perhaps talk about that later on, but this is how to unentangle ourselves from all of the constructs of mind and ideas and concepts we come up with that in many ways are solidifying our sense of self in the world as something that is dissimilar from the world, as something that is not in alignment with the world, as something that is better than the world. And that practice of the unentanglement and the dissolving of all cords and all concepts and all ideas and all patterns that leads to a higher sense of self, as in I am better than this or that or whatever, gives us a position. That's where the feather becomes heavy as a brick, because then it no longer floats in the wind. Then it's no longer flexible. It is no longer following the ways of energy in this reality. And the best way to understand that is to work with the deep meditation practices where we go in and observe everything as energy and understand that everything is energy, that we are energy, and energy is changeable and we are changeable. And the sense of self that tries to withheld and create frames of references or nodal points or a fixed point in energy from where we can have a standpoint and stand erect or sovereign and say this is me and that is that. So we create a dichotomy between me and others or me and reality. That's where we crystallize. That's where we gain heaviness. That's where we get entangled. And that's where we lose our ability for the processes of transformation. So we must understand that the wind takes us wherever it wants. We got that in the Gospels as well. And that we as interactive life form is flexible and our energy system must be fluent. There must be a fluidity to it so that we can adapt to whatever's in front of us. And our sense of self as in an operating, existing form of life that in that moment, in that speck of time, is interacting with energy from where energy units of the reality field present itself in a specific way so that we get an experience, is where we understand that we are light as a feather. And with that, we go in and barely touch what is there. We barely make ourselves noticeable like a feather in that circumstance, in that moment, in that fleeting speck of time where we lightly brush whatever comes our way. And that's the best way to understand what it means to be harmless and to practice mindfulness. Because how can we in our everyday practice be like the feather that floats in the wind, that barely touches anything, and when it does, it is like a kind, subtle, innocent brush that barely changes anything. But at the same time, if it is done with the right manner and from the right perspective, has a huge impact. Because if all were like the feathers in the wind and all were being light as a feather and did not have the huge impact on reality and others around us, where the feather becomes a brick and by that creates harm, well, the world would look pretty different. We also know from the Egyptian mythology that the heart is weighed on a scale where the other end of the scale, on the other scale, is a feather. And if the heart is light as the feather, well, then we have lived a good life. So the feather analogy is clearly something that goes in different aspects. And that's how I was taught mindfulness, to be light as a feather, to understand that my energy has an impact, that I have an impact, that everything that I am has an impact on this reality field. And that my job as the Bodhisattva enlightened being is to ensure that my touch is gentle as a feather and invigorating like a sun ray and kind as the subtle breeze in the sun where we feel relief when it touches us. And these were some of the beautiful pictures that my teacher gave me as I was remembering what I already knew. And it was not just the words when he was sitting there patiently with me, because I was a 10-year-old and I was full of all sorts of boyish energy because I was a male. And with that had little patience to sitting there and understanding these things. But he would take me out in the field and he would show me the flowers. He would show me the butterflies. He would show me these when you have this kind of when a flower withers or the leaves fall from the tree, and these subtle movements, he would show me these movements of the wind with the different items. And that was one of the things I remember the most, how he always used the dynamics of reality to show me what the practice was, what the rise and fall of energies meant, what the cessation of existence meant, by showing me that how things wither and cease to exist, that it comes to life, that it has a cycle, and then it exists for a period of time, and then it changes form. It is not the same while it exists. It starts as a little seed, and it ends up as nothingness, as a way of showing this is the path that we are working on in our everyday practice. We understand that we are within a cycle of coming coming to life, of becoming, and then going to the peak from where we then begin the cycle of unbecoming. And see that as a rise, as a wave that peaks, and a descent where it ceases to exist, and doing that with the same grace as the flower that eagerly rises up to reach the sun and get the sun rays and blossom and unfold its full potentials, from where it sheds off little spores to create new life for other little flowers. And then what it was will then cease to be and cease to exist, but it has contributed to the world and to the reality field with new spores of life, from where new little plants can grow and strive for the sun, rise up and do the same thing. So in that very kind, and he was so patient showing me these things, and it was also the heart energy from where I felt in my heart what he was teaching me. I felt what he had understood. And what I felt was not studied. It was not something he had read in the books, because the keepers of these books were not about studying these books, because we already knew what was in these books. But they had been written down a very long time ago within what we could call a sacred language, where these things were registered, they were recorded, not because we were to utter the words or express the teachings, but because we, in our energy field and who we were and our remembrance of our past lives and what we had been and what we held of codes in our biofield and our emotional field and our mental field, were the sources of energy that kept the words and the symbols in these books alive. We were the keepers of the book, not of the knowledge, but of the energy that vitalized these books. So that's a completely different type of books we're here talking about. And yes, sometimes we were studying the books, but not to learn from it, but to add in energies, to add in vital life forms that would keep these books alive. And you would say, well, is that magic? No, not at all. It's just part of some of the very ancient secret fourth dimensional types of materials that used to be, and these books were some of the last ones that were written in what we could call fourth dimensional energy. So you had to have the higher abilities to even read these books. For others, they might just appear as papers, which it was not probably written on animal skin or parchment or something else, some kind of stiff material, not paper as we know of it. And they would probably just see weird drawings, but not understand the full extent, the holographic extent of these pictures. So the teachings, as they are always given, and that's why it's best to have them as verbal teachings, oral teachings, and not written down, because once you write things down, it will always be in the ones that read it, the interpretation systems of the one that reads it, the constructs of mind. And the living word and the living information that is given is always given through an energy transfer from one that is in the know of the experiences of what it means to work with energy, not via studies, not via information from others, not via channeling, not via something that's given from extraterrestrials or guardians or what have you, but because it's part of who we are, it's part of our inbuilt energy system that in that manner is connected to the lineage, the civilizations we have sprung from. And that's part of our cellular memory. It's part of our entire energy construction that we have these memories, similarly as you have memories of this life. That's not something you have studied. You have not studied how you experienced to put your feet in the sand for the first time. That's an experience you have. And the more lives you have had where you have exercised the understanding of energy and had that ability to process this level of information, where you understand that feet are not just feet and sand is not just sand, and that these two things that combine and meet up in one moment is an expression of a specific type of energy, of a living being that comes in contact with a reality field that at that point is manifested into this crystallized type of mineral units that holds a specific coding that comes from a specific reality or another star perhaps. And that you, as who you are now, with that feeling of this touch and these feet and that sand, have the understanding of how the interaction between the mineralized, crystallized energy units and you as a fluid, flexible being can go in and interact and create ripple effects into the collective fields of what generates sand. So that's also a mindfulness practice. That's an observance of energy. That's an observance of how to interact with energy and understand that your footprint have an effect on where you touch the ground. We see that with the symbols of the swastika that is beneath the feet of the Buddha. Where we touch, we transform, because we are transformative in who and what we are. So these are some of the things that we just know, and it's part of us, and we understand that. And that's also part of the remembrance. So these are where we can say the ones that are selected and were selected at the time. I have no knowledge of others communities that do that anymore. As far as I know, these are the uprising that happened in 1959 was because of the fear of the latest Dalai Lama. And we know that the Chinese are eager to go in and control the rebirth of who and whatever that is. But that's not how I remember my community. It had very little to do with that. It doesn't feel for me as if it was part of that uprising. It feels for me it was part of something else. Either way, the practice of mindfulness and the practice of how to be in connection with who and what we were, and as that understanding of, even though that this is a mini cycle within a big cycle of my existence, that this would change as well, that this would rise and cease to exist as well, that whatever I am is a speck in time, a little leaf in the wind, a subtle feather that brushes your cheek, and perhaps a little bit of sun ray that comes in and shine on a rainy day. But at the end of the day, if you are heavy as a brick, if your entire constitution is unflexible and crystallized like the sand, even though I try to give my impression by my footprint and my understanding of things, the only thing that can change your crystallized structure is if you choose to become flexible. If you choose to go into the observances of how you utilize energy. And the first most important part of that is to learn and observe and attempt to become harmless. And that is also expressed in many different ways in many different systems. And within the ideas I have put together in the progression sciences are tied into some of the principles and the rules of, with the principle goes with the way you work with your own energy system to secure or to upgrade it so that it will achieve the highest purity rate as well as the highest standards. And the rules of engagement are part of the different races that are here and how we engage with each other so we don't get to war with each other. So that's something we have agreed on. So the principles are technically something you administer with yourself, similarly as the 8 precepts or the 10 commandments or whatever kind of system of thought or constructs of mind that you find suitable for your continued expression of who and what you are. However, I would, as the one I am, even though I have put time and effort in to explain how these principles can be utilized in the reconstruction of your middle domain energy system, when it comes to the outer domains where we are now, that is, the middle domain are connected to the heart field, but the biofield is connected to this reality field. And that's where the practices of how to utilize and transform energy comes in play in a different way. And that is where reality and us comes in connection with each other and becomes the main object of how to work with energy. Whereas when we work with the heart field, it's about us and others and how we interact around others to create the most optimal situation for all involved, and express our energies as the highest vibrational rate we can, leading to the highest standards in whatever circumstance that we are in. And these standards depends on original genetics and consciousness potentials and whatever type of consciousness abilities that we have chosen to express. So it's not the same one fit for all. It depends on who and what we are. But when we talk about the outer domain, we talk about the physicality, and the physicality as part of a space, as part of a reality where who and what we are has a huge impact on the world that we are part of. And that's part of the outer domain lessons, where again, the understanding of being harmless like a feather and really not leave much imprint in this world becomes important. That's where we learn to transform energies where we walk. That's where we learn to transform energy when we talk. That's where we learn to transform energy when whatever we do. And that's how I would create a new type of understanding of what mindfulness is. The understanding that we tread lightly as feathers in this world. And when we walk as if we were with feet of fire, so that we will transform whatever we tread on, whatever we step on, so that whatever comes in contact with us will lift it to its highest potentials, and not just as others in our ways of being around others, from heart to heart, from the impressions that we give others by the energy when they touch our energy system, or when we touch their energy system in communication or in caring or in relationships or in whatever interaction that we are having with other life forms, no matter what life form it is. When we work with the biofield and the outer domain, or the density 1 configuration, then we understand that this work is also how we impact the reality field. And that's the next step of our journey, where we take everything we have learned and now begin to understand we're working with even more subtle type of energy, with more invisible types of transformational processes, compared to the ones we were doing when we were working with other people, or ourselves in connection with other people. So with that little podcast here on the ideas of how I would interpret mindfulness, I will probably return to it later on. But here I kind of laid a foundation of some of the concepts that are known to most of you, but at the same time giving my angle on it and how I remember being taught without using the words in English, as well as not studying it by text, but getting it handed over by a very knowledgeable teacher, but at the same time not being taught concepts of mind or ideas, but getting impressions of energy that were not meant to teach me or mentor me or produce some kind of constructs of mind. Because one of the main things about being what we could call light as a feather is that whatever we are and whatever we work with are not to be there forever. They are tools in the moment to transform energy. And then once that is done, we let go of these ideas or thought forms or systems or methods. So what we have left is the remembrance of the knowledge of how to transform energy. And one of the most important things in that is the kindness in our heart and the deep understanding of that true kindness is the understanding of how to be in the world with the greatest care, so that wherever we touch and whatever we come in contact with, or whatever we choose a path, and we choose a method, and we choose a way of behaving, and we choose a way of feeling, and we choose a way of thinking that leads to the least distortion of any forms of energy. We seek to purify our fields to the degree where they stand as shining light, as it said, in a manner that our very existence in itself becomes transformative. Thank you.